Our venue partner is IDBI Bank. The excitement in this hall this morning is palpable. We have Mr. Mihir Bose in conversation with Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Mr. Mihir Bose is an award-winning journalist and author who has written and broadcast for major media outlets. Mr. Bose is the author of more than 30 books, including Silver, The Spy Who Fooled the Nazis. His books range from biographies and histories to sports and business. Among them are Bollywood, a narrative history of India's film industry, and a biography of Subhash Chandra Bose. His books on sports include Game Changer, How the English Premier League Came to Dominate the World, and Manchester Disunited, Trouble and Takeover at the World's Richest Football Club. Author politician Dr. Shashi Tharoor is a second-term Lok Sabha MP from Thiruvananthapuram. He is a previous Minister of State in the Government of India. He has served as the Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. Dr. Tharoor is an award-winning author of works of both fiction and non-fiction, with his latest being Why Am I a Hindu? He has written hundreds of articles, op-eds, and book reviews in a wide range of publications, including the New York Times and Washington Post. Hugely popular on social media platforms, which probably would be the understatement of the year. He is an excellent orator, and the packed hall this morning is a testimony to that. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming both our speakers to the podium this morning.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure and privilege to share a platform with Shashi Tharoor, Dr. Tharoor. I hope he won't mind if I call him Shashi. Of course, he needs no introduction. But I live in London, and can I tell you, in the last few months, my reputation has gone up because friends of mine have read Inglorious Empire, most of them, almost all of them, English, one should say white English these days. And when I said I know Dr. Shashi Tharoor, they said, my goodness, do you know him? He's written this. Were we so bad? And I don't comment further on that. But to go further, the other day I found that Dr. Shashi Tharoor's reputation even extends to the sauna in my local gym at Hammersmith. I was there while I was there. I've been trying to lose weight. A fat Indian, doctors in UK say, must be diabetic, so you've got to lose weight. Anyway, so there I was, and this man said, I think I've seen you before. When I said, well, occasionally I've been on television, he said, oh, I think that's your chat-up line. And then he said, I must have seen you when he had interviewed Dr. Shashi Tharoor. So there you are, the man of great talent, but even extends to the gyms of West London. I mean, you can't ask for more than that. This is a wonderful book, which I first read on the PDF, and now I've got it on hardcover. And actually, it resonates so much with my own upbringing. You talk of your father introducing, if you like, to religion. It was my mother. Every Thursday morning, she prayed to Goddess Lakshmi. It was wonderful for me because the sweets she gave Goddess Lakshmi, I could eat as much as I liked. Normally, she didn't allow me to have sweets, and despite the fact that we are Bengalis from what was East Bengal and therefore lost everything, in the Thursday evening we prayed to Gani Baba, a Muslim saint. So, and of course you talk about Vivekananda extensively. My only claim to fame is that Vivekananda, like me, was born on the 12th of January. But, and my grandfather was blessed by Vivekananda. I see Vivekananda, the present Prime Minister says he's a great devotee of Vivekananda. I don't know if anybody in his family was blessed by Vivekananda. Maybe it was, and we haven't discovered. It'll come out soon. Now, tell me, you say your timing of your book, you say you have written to discover yourself, to explain yourself, and of course also to talk about how Hinduism is now being used in the political system. But can I put it to you, Shashi, that you are behaving a bit like politicians in America who are standing or planning to stand for presidency. We've got a year to go for the election. This is going to be your platform to become the Prime Minister of India, surely. This is a book in which you say, here I am a Hindu, I go to the temple, I worship, but I'm not Hindutva. So this is, would it be right to say, this is soft Hindutva? Go to the temple, but don't bring the temple into politics.
Gosh, you've given me a lot there to react to, Mihir. First, you just betrayed the fact that you live in London, because no one runs for Prime Minister in India. So the country has its own system, the parties decide their own leadership. I happen to be in a party where we've just decided on a leader. There is no question, quote unquote, of running for anything that isn't already spoken for. But secondly, on the question of timing this for political purposes, in many ways, these are ideas that have been prefigured in my books for the last 30 years. The great Indian novel, about 3 decades ago, with its emphasis on Dharma, my novel Riots, talking about Hindu-Muslim violence leading up to the Ram Janmabhoomi Babri Masjid issue, my book India from Midnight to the Millennium 20 years ago, in which I talked about some of these themes of Hinduism versus Hindutva, obviously much more briefly. But the thoughts are very much there. So in many ways, this book is a product of an adult lifetime of reflection and an entire lifetime of experience and observation. The other thing that's worth saying, and you've already said it masterfully, is that many of us have grown up with a certain Hinduism which we don't recognize in the Hinduism of contemporary political discourse. We are suddenly finding, as Hindus who have had a certain set of beliefs, that our ideas of Hinduism, which we took for granted growing up in Hindu households across India, saw practiced by other Hindus we knew and met, is suddenly distorted into some sort of faith of delirious fanaticism and Muslim bashing, a faith in which human beings are assaulted in the name of protecting the cow, a faith in which, honestly, and since this is an analogy that will appeal to you, the adherence to the faith is equated more or less or resembles nothing so much as the team loyalty of the British football hooligan. You know, my team is better than your team and I'll hit you on the head if you disagree. That's not Hinduism. That never was the Hinduism of the vast majority of us who grew up in this country. And I felt the time had come to say so. You know, having been caricatured for years as quote-unquote anti-Hindu and pseudo-secular, not secular, but S-I-C-K-U-L-A-R, which is the favored term of abuse of the Hindutva trolls. I had, for a long time believed that religion being something between you and your maker or your idea of the divine is something you practice quietly at home and didn't show outside. It would almost seem unseemly to do so. But when the public perception of who you are is so completely being traduced by these attacks, I thought the time had come to actually come right forward and say, you're wrong, this is what I believe in, and it's not what you claim I ought to believe.
Why do you think that in India, the India that I grew up in compared to the India now, what was considered rather fantastic ideas seem to have become mainstream? And let me give you an example. Many years ago, while researching my biography of Subhash Bose, I met a man called P.N. Oak. P.N. Oak had been part of the INA, and I met him in Delhi, took him to the Gaylord.
He's the one who wrote the Taj Mahal is a Hindu palace.
Yeah, well, he wrote that, and he also wrote the missing chapters of world history. And I took him to the Gaylord, where he embarrassed everybody by asking for Ovaltine and Horlicks. But anyway, settled for coffee. And then he told me how the Hindus had an empire which included England. And the reason why the English changed their date at 12:30 is because it's 5 o'clock then, and the sun used to ride on the Ganges and so on. And that's when the call would go out. The point was that was considered fantastic. But now we have people saying that the Hindus had atom bombs and thermonuclear devices and sent missions to the moon and elsewhere, in the days of Ram Rajya. How has this come about? Why has this become almost mainstream?
Well, because frankly, those who have entertained such far-fetched and frankly absurd ideas are now in power. Power has an amazing effect in terms of your ability to command an audience. And now that those who've come to power are the ones who believe such things, our Prime Minister has made a speech in which he said that the sight of Ganesha's head on a human body is proof that India was a world expert in plastic surgery. Now the irony is that India was the world's pioneer in plastic surgery, but anybody who knows the approximate size of the smallest imaginable elephant head and the elephant neck, I beg your pardon, elephant head and the largest imaginable human neck knows that two cannot be made to fit by the most adept plastic surgeon. Now the problem with these fantastic statements where you take an extraordinary idea and reduce it to its basic literal is that you end up in a situation where the actual achievements of Indian plastic surgery, Shushruta was the world's first recorded surgeon. The oldest surgical instruments found anywhere in the world are 2,000 years old and were found in India. The first recorded plastic surgery operation, a rhinoplasty, was conducted in ancient India. All of these scientifically verifiable facts become discredited by the absurd fantasies spoken by those who are in power today. Similarly, all this talk about Pushpak Viman, these planes flying. We had the Indian Science Congress, one of the most reputable scientific conferences in the world for the last 6 decades, being reduced to a joke with a tweet sponsored by the ruling forces coming and arguing that India actually had jet planes 2,000 years ago and basing himself entirely on a spurious Vedic text that was a forgery from the 1920s and had been discredited almost immediately after it was released in the world in the 1920s. So this kind of ahistorical, unscientific approach gains credibility from the credulity of those in power.
But isn't it a fact that partly it's a reaction to the fact that for at least 200 years, the Hindus have been demonized? I mean, people in Britain find it difficult to believe when I tell them that it was the British were anti-Hindu, not anti-Muslim. And if you read, for instance, Beverly Nichols' verdict on India, published in 1944, sponsored by the British government, it contrasts Ganesh as an evil figure compared to Jesus Christ. And you mentioned a lot of Ganesh. And that was the book that Winston Churchill recommended to his wife, and later on came and said it represents Hinduism in its real light, and they are the foul people. So one can understand if you've been demonized so long that you will react to it. And people like Savarkar and others were in a way reacting to a colonial straitjacket, were they not?
That's a fair point up to a point. You're quite right that, you have people like Beverly Nichols. 20 years earlier, Catherine Mayo's Mother India was equally harsh about Hinduism. Churchill himself said there are beastly people with a beastly religion. That was his attitude towards Hindus. And of course, we saw this, for example, in the partition of Bengal, way back in 1905, when essentially the Lieutenant Governor of Bengal, Bantam Fuller, actually said, we British have 2 wives in India, the Hindu and the Muslim, and we much prefer the Muslim wife, openly. And that was, of course, to justify the creation of a Muslim majority province in East Bengal. So the British played their dirty game, no doubt about it. But since these views clearly were in pursuance of a particular agenda, a nakedly stated agenda of divide and rule, I'm not sure why we should necessarily have to take it that seriously, particularly since at the same time, some of the giants of the Indian nationalist movement were Hindu and were being admired around the world. Mahatma Gandhi was certainly hugely respected and admired. Books were written about him, documentaries made and so on around the world while he was alive. Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography was a bestseller in the New York Times, a #1 bestseller. So these are not, it's not as if the only depiction of Hindus available in the Western world was the caricature. And certainly there were others who saw Hinduism differently, and I don't think there was any call for the kind of inferiority complex that seems to have emerged in this kind of thinking. But it has. There is no question that a lot of the Hindutva chauvinism comes from a deep-seated inferiority complex, a perception of having been subjugated, conquered, humiliated, not just by the British, but as they see it for 1,000 years earlier by the Muslims, particularly in the north. So when I wrote Inglorious Empire, which was published in India as an era of darkness, and I talked about 200 years of foreign rule and subjugation, people like the Prime Minister himself spoke of 1,200 years of foreign rule and subjugation. I said that's simply not right. The British came here and ruled for their benefit. They drained resources from this country and sent it off to England. But the Muslims who came here stayed on to rule, and they weren't exploiting India to send money or jewels off to the Fergana Valley or to Samarkand or Bukhara. Whatever they looted, they spent here. They married here. They had progeny here. This is the country in which they invested their lives and their future. It's a very different story from that of the British.
Shashi, but there is one point. You're right in saying that they shouldn't now be feeling oppressed or demonized. But did not Jawaharlal Nehru, and I'm a great admirer of Jawaharlal Nehru, despite being told at home that Subhash Bose was the king over the water and would come back and rescue India. As a Bengali, you can understand why I was under that Bengali influence. But nevertheless, did he not, and the Congress Party, miss out? You talk about secularism in India did not mean irreligiousness, but when I was growing up, and I'm probably a bit older than you, we were encouraged never to talk about what your religion was. That was considered communalism. And let me give you two examples of what happened. The reconstruction of the temple of Somnath, which Nehru was opposed to, which K.M. Munshi sponsored, which Rajendra Prasad opened, and Nehru's biographer Gopal said Nehru considered it a medieval act. Did he not miss a trick there? I mean, not because to glorify that the Hindus have got back because Muhammad of Ghazni, who took it as his winter sport to come to India every year for 16 years, did that. But actually, I've been to Temple of Somnath. It's not a glorification. It's done quite well. Did he not miss a trick there that, you could, if you like, revisit history and not be chauvinistic or proclaim it? And I feel Nehru missed a trick there.
That's arguably true. In fact, I've been to Somnath too, Mihir, and it is rather beautiful with a tremendous amount of space.
It's very well done, I must say.
Those of us in Thiruvananthapuram who know the Padmanabha Swami Kshetram know there are very few temples in India with this sense of spaciousness and quiet. Somnath is one of them. But anyway, I mean, unlike most other North Indian temples, which are much more congested and small. But coming back to your point, Nehruji himself was not a believer in any religion. He was an agnostic. Atheist, agnostic. I don't think he ever specified whether he didn't believe or didn't believe that belief could be proved. But he was not. And he in much of his private correspondence, there are statements to the effect that I have no patience for sadhus and Maulvis. He was not interested in religion particularly. He was leaning towards a Marxist idea that religion is a kind of opiate that dulls the sensibilities of people. But at the same time, he was never hostile to the faith. I think on Somnath, what Nehruji actually said was that the government should have nothing to do with it. And he was opposed to the president going off and inaugurating. But if private individuals wanted to do something, he had no problem with that. That was the distinction. Similarly, when you look at Nehruji's attitude towards religion, don't forget that it was during his time that the launching of Indian ships involved the smashing of a coconut rather than a champagne bottle on the side of the ship. Now that's a purely Hindu cultural practice. Nehru had really no difficulty with that per se. I think secularism in Nehru's mind was much more about let everyone be what they are. The state should not privilege any one of them. And the state should not sort of ostensibly have a religion. So as long as India was a secular republic, it meant it was not a Hindu state. We didn't want to buy into the logic of partition. If Pakistan was a state for Muslims, we were not going to accept the proposition that what remained was a state for Hindus. Nehru, Gandhiji, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad had all fought for a nationalist movement that believed in representing every Indian of every religious faith. We didn't want to give that up merely because the Pakistan project had succeeded. So the answer to Pakistan was not a Hindustan, it was rather a secular state in the sense that everyone of every faith had equal rights in this society.
Yeah, except that, the creation of Pakistan was by a man who himself was not Muslim in any way, drank whiskey, ate pork, whereas Maulana Abdul Kalam Azad was extremely religious. I accept that. But where I think one should question you, if I may, Shashi, and I do this with great politeness and subservience, that you say none of the religions was privileged by the state. In fact, the Muslim religion has been privileged. There is no common civil law. The British didn't have a common civil law because they didn't want it, they didn't suit them. The Hindu Marriage Act was pushed through by Nehru in great opposition to Rajendra Prasad, who didn't want to sign the bill. There was a lot of opposition. Why? That was the trick missed then. Why was this normal civil law? I mean, if you live in this country, you're a citizen of this country, surely, in terms of marriage and divorce, the law should be the same. You can worship what you like, that's a different matter.
Mihir, I think with hindsight you can say a trick was missed, but if you read the politics of those first 10 years after independence, when the Hindu code, first of all, there was this entire proposition being advanced. There were prisoners of the colonial mindset in which every religion had its own personal law, which was a legacy of the colonial decision not to interfere as much as possible with the overt practices of any community for fear of antagonizing.
And also to reinforce the British view that India was not a nation, India was a collection of religious groups.
Correct. And therefore, they had a separate Hindu personal law, Muslim personal law, Christian personal law, Parsi personal law, and so on. And that was the British. Now the problem is, the nationalist leaders were conscious that because of 200 years of British policy, communities had acquired, if you like, a vested interest in the preservation of their own personal laws and their own customs. So when the idea of a universal civil code, which is mentioned in the Constitution as a desirable objective, was to be pursued, the political discussions centered around the fact that to do so could risk being seen as an assault on the minorities. And so it would be politically more courageous, it was felt, to start off with the majority community and then work your way through the rest. So the Hindu Code Bill, which reconciled various elements of Hindu personal law and codified them and indeed reformed them, granting women for the first time certain rights they didn't have before, this was itself a big challenge. It wasn't, in fact, Ambedkar resigned over the government not pushing the Hindu Code Bill fast enough. And it was Kailash Nath Karju as Home Minister who finally took on the responsibility of piloting it through in 56. It took 9 long years of very, very tense negotiations, Hindu traditionalists saying no, and being reinforced in their opposition by the reluctance of other community leaders to see their own laws refused. So I think given the politics of the time, particularly the first decade after a very traumatic partition, I don't know how fair it would be for us, with hindsight, to say, oh, Nehru, you should have done that then. Maybe if we were looking back in tranquility from a more tranquil period, we could have made that argument. But the BJP, which is a passionate believer in all this, is now in its 9th year in office. They had 6 years under Vajpayee, 3 years under Modi. Have they been able to advance it? The politics of this issue are ultimately so sensitive that even a party avowedly devoted to Hindutva is treading carefully.
But it's not helped by your party. After all, Nehru's grandson Rajiv Gandhi amended the constitution after the Supreme Court judgment on the Banu case, and your party is now opposing the bill going through Parliament about the triple talaq. So this is vote bank politics now.
No, wait a minute. You got it wrong. On Shah Banu, I'm on your side, and my book India from Midnight to Millennium lays out very clearly my objections and my disappointment in what Rajiv Gandhi felt it necessary to do at that time. But on triple talaq, our position is not against the bill. No one is in favor of triple talaq in this country, not even most of the Muslims I know. In fact, no Muslim I know has said to me he's in favor of triple talaq. It's not a particular... Many Muslims who are very conservative Muslims say this is a distortion of Islam. The problem that the Congress party has is that it seems to have been drafted very hastily with 2 major questions still unanswered, which we raised in the Lok Sabha debate, which the BJP was able to ignore because of their crushing majority, but they can't ignore in the Rajya Sabha, and that's why we're saying let's refer it to a committee. The first question is, what is the precedent we are setting in ensuring that a civil problem becomes criminalized? Why are we putting ourselves in a position where a civil offense leads to a criminal punishment? And there is no good answer to this. There is no other civil offense you can think of that causes a criminal sentence. So we need to understand, first of all, whether the government has thought through why this is necessary, and secondly, whether the government is conscious of the precedent it's setting for other kinds of civil problems. The second question is, why does a woman object to her husband getting rid of her with triple talaq? Because she is not ready to be divorced. She wants some more time to try and save the marriage, to protect her children. She still needs support from her husband and so on. Now, you're saying on the one hand you want to protect the woman who doesn't want to be divorced in an instant. On the other hand, you're throwing her husband in jail where he clearly will not support her or her children or keep the family together. What's the logic in that? So these are the two objections we've raised before. We said, please think this through, either give us credible answers or have a committee of parliament. Most legislation goes through committee. It's relatively unusual for a law of this magnitude and social implications to be brought straight to the floor without having gone through committee. All we're saying is, study it in committee and we'll vote on it up. We are not defending triple talaq.
You, in your book, mentioned quite correctly and very judiciously the rise in intolerance about Padmavati's film shows that. But again here, and this is not to justify it, and of course it's very worrying, the new Indian government also banned books. Arthur Koestler's book, The Lotus and the Robot, was banned. In fact, one of my books is banned, The History of the Aga Khans. Yes, that was banned by the Bombay government. My only consolation is it was the same law that was used to ban a book of Rabindranath Tagore by the colonial government. So that you know, my Bengali relatives
distinguished company.
Yeah, absolutely, and I can't even speak Bengali and can't read Tagore in the original, which is a mark held against me. The point is, if you like, the Hindutva movement are using the weapons which were left behind and which for years of Congress rule, nothing was done about it.
Yes, I mean, this is something again that I've complained about in my Inglorious Empire, that we were stuck with this British era colonial legacy, the so-called rule of law with the Indian Penal Code, these kinds of absolutely distorted acts, but unfortunately never got rid of them. And I have been, I hope, a fairly staunch advocate of freedom of expression. Even on Padmavat, I was one of the very few in the Congress party, perhaps the only one, who was foolish enough to stick my neck out and say that these protests are wrong and unjustified. The truth is that we live in volatile times, and there is a perception on the part of many in our country that if a book or a film or a work of art is likely to incite a riot, it's better to get the piece of art out of the way rather than risk the loss of life and damage that a riot would induce. Now, the classic liberal answer is, if people are threatening to riot, handle them. Don't proscribe the art. But it seems that India is not yet at a stage in which we are able to maintain that position consistently. All I can plead for is to saying, while we respect the idea that rather than lighting a match in a petrol station, snuff out the match rather than close down the petrol station, nonetheless, to be as liberal as possible in these judgments. I mean, I don't think that banning a book by Jayashree Mishra, who's sitting here, which has happened to her in UP, right, is actually, going to cause any problems for, I mean, not banning it would not have caused any problems for anybody in terms of law and order. Nothing that a halfway competent, district magistrate and police superintendent couldn't have handled and put down. But it's often politically expedient for a government, and law and order is a state subject, it's usually the state governments we're talking about, to surrender to those who are threatening violence rather than to tell them we will deal with you sternly. Now look what happened on this Padmavat in this Karni Sena group, which is both inconsequential and misguided, because in fact they were agitating against a film that glorifies the Rajput community and its valor beyond all human imagining. Could not be more supportive of the precise things that they want. This Karni Sena actually managed to burn a Haryana Roadways bus, stone a school bus full of terrified children, and do lakhs of rupees of property damage, because the state government was either inept or complicit in their response as law and order, as maintainers of law and order. We know of other cases, Salman Rushdie being told not to come to Calcutta for the book fair because the local police said they could not guarantee his safety. We've had issues around the Jaipur Retreat Festival. It's tough. You need a state government that's determined. You need a judicial system that's robust and will stand up for rights. I remember the Kerala government actually offering M.F. Hussain an award at a time when he was in self-imposed exile in the last years of his life. And I went to him and said, please accept the award. The Kerala government is promising you security from the moment you land to the moment you leave. We want to see you back on the soil of the country you love. And he said, I would love to do it, but what will you do if these fellows go to a court and get a court order to arrest me? I don't want to spend an hour in jail, let alone a night or a week. This was the fear. And you got all these institutions that could come in the way of this. So far, the highest court, the Supreme Court, has been very liberal in its interpretation of freedom of expression laws. And I would even argue it's expanded a bit the understanding, including on the Padmavat issue, where it took the position that it's a duty of the state to protect people against violence. But the worry is that before you get to the Supreme Court, you will go through several levels of harassment, and people censor themselves, such as, for example, the theatre owners of Gujarat, Rajasthan, Haryana are not showing Padmavat, even though the court and the law is in their favor, because they say, how will it help us if our theatre is damaged? That's the thing.
Well, of course, you share with Narendra Modi one thing. Both of you are admirers of Vivekananda. Now, is it possible that...
I think the one difference is I've actually read Vivekananda.
Yeah, no, you've read Vivekananda. But is it possible that one of the problems, and I'm not saying this frivolously, is that people just take bits of Vivekananda that they want? The bit of Vivekananda that always appealed to me was when he said, you will get closer to God by playing football than by reading the Bhagavad Gita, which explains my devotion to football. So maybe is a solution that Narendra Modi ought to be playing football. I mean, I don't know how good he would be, but I can see him as quite a thuggish defender, but, who knows.
Well, we're going to give him a lot to defend because, so far he's been very much an aggressive player. We would like to respond to that, push him back on his defense.
But do you... you've written this book, you say this is not a political statement in the sense, but this is a soft Hindutva in order to claim the temple back for the Congress party, is it not?
I forgot to respond to that provocative phrase. You gave me so much in that initial question. I reacted to most of it, not the soft Hindutva. No, I reject that idea completely. This is not soft Hindutva because Hindutva embodies a certain idea of Hinduism and a certain view of the world and a certain idea of the place of Hinduism in Indian politics, which we reject utterly. At the risk of playing with words, mine is Hinduism, not Hindutva. So it is not soft Hindutva. It is in fact saying that Hindutva is not Hinduism because the Hinduism that I have known, summarized, described, substantiated with quotations from the scriptures and from the great souls and great teachers of Hinduism is a religion of acceptance, not a religion of bigotry. It's a religion of ahimsa and satya, not a religion of distortion and violence. All of these arguments, and therefore, when we say, you say going to temples is soft Hindutva, I say no. Going to temples, as Rahul Gandhi did in the Gujarat elections, is a way of neutralizing the Hindu narrative. We didn't want to abdicate the space to the BJP to say, look, we are the only good Hindus, vote for us. We want to say, look, we are good Hindus in a better way, in a different way, in a more inclusive way than those guys are. But now that we've got the Hindu issue out of the way, they go to temples, we go to temples, now we can push that out of the way. Let's talk economics, let's talk development. Let's ask you, is your life better for having been ruled by the BJP? And so in a way, it's a way of neutralizing the Hindu argument rather than giving a soft version of it.
But the problem is that once a people or a section of the people are convinced they have lost out, it's very difficult to convince them they haven't lost out. We've seen this in Trump, We saw in Brexit, in the UK where I lived, that you convince a section of the people you've lost out. And I remember coming back to India in the 80s and seeing a slogan on the wall at Kemp's Corner in Mumbai, the town I grew up in, Mrs. Gandhi saved the Hindus. And I thought, what is wrong with the Hindus? They're the majority. I mean, how do you do that? It's very difficult to reconvince a people that they haven't lost out, that their religion is not in danger.
Fair enough. I mean, the truth is that there's been an assiduous propaganda about Hinduism and danger and so on for a few decades now, and some people have been convinced by it. To my mind, the only effective counter-argument is whatever you may have believed about things like quote-unquote minority appeasement, which always was a slightly silly thing to say, because if the minorities have been so much appeased, why are they still in such bad shape? Take the Muslim community. Look at the Satar Commission report about the rather poor condition of that community and ask what has all these so-called policies of appeasement got them. I don't think that you can truthfully make a very credible, rational argument for that view. But even if you had once believed it, let's shift the argument slightly and say, all right, so you feel you were hard done by. Have you been any better done by under the BJP's rule? The housewife who was paying 390 rupees for a gas cylinder and is now paying over 700, is she better off? The chap with a little scooter or the auto rickshaw driver who is paying more for petrol and diesel at the pump than he was when oil was $140 a barrel and it's plummeted since, is he better off? Is this not a government that has exploited the ordinary human being, the Indian citizen, the Aam Aadmi, the common man, in the name of its policies of reasserting Hinduism? And what tangible benefits have you got from such reassertion? Is your life better? I mean, these are the questions that I think we need to ask. And I think if people ask themselves that question, they'll realize that their vote did not get them a better life.
Well, thank you, Shashi. We have a few more minutes, so... Oh, it's water to
We can open it up.
And perhaps we could open it to the floor and get a response. I'm sure a lot of you would like to ask questions. Could you just
There's a mic
wait for the
going
mic?
around,
And can I please ask that you ask a question, not make a statement or try and write a book in 5 minutes, if I can make that point.
You are a Hindu because you are born as a Hindu. You continue to be a Hindu because you believe in Hindu rituals and all rights. Maybe that S. Chandrasekhar, Nobel laureate, he was still reading Gita, not because he was a religious man. Oppenheimer, when atom bomb exploded, he quoted Gita. So I think you continue to be a Hindu because you believe in Hindu rites and rituals, going to temples and all. Maybe the politics may not be maybe different than what you perceive as Hindutva. Hindutva is different, I think. Okay, these are only things that you continue to be Hindu.
Right. Well, actually, the very first line of my book is indeed, why am I Hindu? Because I was born one, I suppose. But then I go on to substantiate it in slightly more depth, sir, than your comment implies. In fact, as far as going to temples is concerned, you know that there are 4 ways in which you can practice the faith. There is certainly Bhakti Yoga, which is what going to temples, worship, rites and rituals are. There is Jnana Yoga, which is reading and reflection, meditation. There is Karma Yoga, which is service and action. And then there is Raja Yoga, which involves, of course, breathing and internal techniques. Out of all of those, I would say probably Bhakti Yoga for me comes only about third. I'm not an avid temple goer. I do go. But for me, reading, reflection and searching for what I perceive to be the truth is far more important to me in many ways. I would argue with you that it's entirely compatible to have a strongly held, if you like, intellectual belief in Hinduism, though I hope I go beyond that in substantiating what I'm talking about in the book. In the book, I've talked about, the first half pretty much is indeed an explication of Hinduism as it's taught, as it's practiced, as the scriptures have it, and as the great Mahatmas, the great teachers of Hinduism have explained it. And then there is a section on political Hindutva where I summarize in their own words the views of Savarkar, of Golwalkar, of Deen Dayal Upadhyay. And only then do I come to the political conclusion of taking back Hinduism from those who were distorted. So if you read the argument in that sequence in the book, I think you will discover that your question simplifies it a bit too much.
Well, in your book, actually, half of your book is devoted to politics. You've mentioned the 4 tenets of Hinduism. The one thing I find about Hinduism very appealing is that it has the best cuisine of all the religions. So in that sense, Hinduism is more of a cuisine. It provides the best food after prayers of any religion that I know of. So, that should appeal to anybody. But anyway, another question. There's... Anil here.
Shashi, I want you to speculate on this, because I know the numbers are not available. I think we would all like to believe that the majority of Hindus believe in Hinduism as against Hindutva. But if an opinion poll were conducted today, what do you think the results would be? My own feeling would be that most people are veering or have already veered to Hindutva, because there's a lot of antagonism to Muslims, the feeling of victimhood. All these things may be unjustified, but they are there. And then, secondly, what can be done to counter this?
Well, I think, when you speak of an opinion poll, it also depends on where the poll is conducted. A lot of the opinion polls in this country are a bit skewed in the sense that they're much more in the urban areas, which paradoxically ought to be where people are better read, have more access to more sources of information. But paradoxically, this is in fact the part of the country, the urban India, where the BJP is stronger. Whereas if you look at rural India, where people just live without thinking about these things too much, there's a great deal more of acceptance of difference, the key that Vivekananda preached, than there perhaps is in places where people have thought about. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing, as the old line goes. So I would not hazard a guess as to where the opinion polls might go. But if you explained in 2 sentences what we meant by Hindutva and what we meant by Hinduism, my suspicion is that a majority of Hindus would still go for Hinduism. It's just that there has been a very successful conflation of the two. There are many in the Hindutva movement who basically say all that Hindutva means is Hindu-ness. Therefore, we are talking about the authentic way of being Hindu. And that, unfortunately, has fooled a lot of people. So my book is a first salvo. And the salvo will certainly get stronger when it's translated into Indian languages, as it will be. Already, the Hindi translation is being worked on, a Malayalam translation is being worked on, a Telugu translation is being worked on. So there will be a way of reaching out to ordinary Indians to say, indeed, let's understand the difference and let's decide which way we want to go. Let's conduct the poll after all those translations have been published.
But are we not in danger that in a way the situation and what Anil was saying there, I mean, in Bombay, where I grew up, now accommodation is segregated along religion. If you're a Muslim, you can't buy certain buildings. And I've seen on the internet and heard from people why Jawaharlal Nehru really was a Muslim. So, all this sort of thing has gone so far that in your book you talk about the fear of a second partition.
Yeah, well, I have actually introduced a private member's bill in Parliament to create an anti-discrimination law so that this kind of thing will not just be against convention or practice or decent behavior, will be actually against the law. You should not be able to discriminate against somebody, for example, on housing, on the grounds of religion, gender, sexual preference, whatever. And yet people do. One of the clever techniques they've come up with is these so-called vegetarian housing societies. I'm a vegetarian myself, but I think it's actually a fairly contemptible way of ensuring that that Muslims would not buy into or rent in those societies.
Sorry, could you just speak up?
Anthropologists all say we are in a knowledge society. Knowledge society means you know it. Then why should you think of the religion as such, which has 8,000 years old? It was born 8,000 years back. So your child is 14 counts superior to you or me, our children. So why should you think of a Hindu or a Christian unknown? In Technoparty you won't see a Hindu or a Christian. Only people who can manage knowledge into practice. So that is it.
Thank you, sir. No, that in many ways would be an ideal. I would love to be able to practice my faith in private, to meet other people without even being conscious of what their faith is. And we should have a world in which people, I've often said this, that how they worship or not, what God they choose to adore or not, is their business. That would be the ideal world, and that remains my ideal. That was indeed the objective within which I was brought up. But let me also say that to take that position today for anybody in public life or politics in contemporary India is to bury oneself's head in the sand, because it is impossible to escape religion. Actually, one could argue even that is not a new insight, because in our country, religion is so deeply permeated the public consciousness of individuals that even avowedly atheist parties like the Communists and the DMK have had to make their compromises with religion. In Calcutta, during the Durga Puja, I went to high school in Calcutta, the youth leagues of the two communist parties compete with each other to put up the most lavish puja pandals to the goddess Durga during the annual Durga Puja. That is the kind of attitude of the communist parties. Where are you actually going to? This year, of course, last year, we saw the Communist Party Marxist in Kerala taking out a procession with Lord Krishna on a chariot. So, I mean, this is the kind of, everyone is realizing that when religion has such a deep hold on the masses, you cannot pretend to speak for the masses, represent them, without showing some connection. So the idea of actually keeping your beliefs and practices to yourself is simply not politically feasible. Perhaps the day will come. But Nehruji actually was in that sense far more sort of unreligious or irreligious in his outlook than any political leader for the 70 years afterwards.
The gentleman there.
Hi sir, I want to have a clarity on one topic. In your previous books you talk about Nehruvian secularism, and I think you are a strong supporter of Nehruvian secularism. But in this particular text I think you will talk about pluralism. So which do you prefer, secularism or pluralism? Or India just needs a secular state or a pluralist state?
No, I have been consistent on this in that I have argued that secularism, strictly speaking, is and has always been a misnomer. Because if you look up an English dictionary, secularism specifically means the absence of religion. Any enterprise from which religion is wholly absent can be called a secular enterprise. Whereas even from Nehru's day onwards, whether he personally was secular or not, he was. The fact is that the state was actually promoting pluralism. Nehru himself came up with the metaphor of the palimpsest. I don't know if you know what a palimpsest is. If you go and write on a wall and then I come and write on top of what you have written without erasing what you've written, and she comes and writes on top of what I have written without erasing what either of us has written, and then he comes and writes on top of what she has written, and so on, the net result of all these writings, one on top of the other, is a palimpsest. And that is what Nehru said India was, which is in fact pluralism. It means we all exist, no one effaces the other, nor does the absence of faith actually prevail. Now we have got entangled into a needless argument on this issue, because once you get to the Indian languages, in particular Sanskrit and Hindi, there is the criticism of Nehruvian secularism on the grounds that secularism means dharma nirpekshata. There is distancing yourself from dharma, which is impossible literally for a Hindu, because a Hindu is enjoined to live according to his dharma. And therefore that what we should have been talking about is panth nirpekshata, that is distancing yourself from any particular religion or sect. To my mind, that was actually what we always were. But because we use the English word secularism, we left ourselves open to this line of argument, and therefore I've suggested let's emphasize pluralism. 20 years ago in India from Midnight to the Millennium, I said the same thing. It is true that in my biography of Nehru, I stuck to the word secularism because that was, after all, it was a description of the 4 pillars of Nehruvianism, and secularism was his pillar. But I still think that from the start, if he had preferred to use the word pluralism, he might actually have been able to change the discourse from what it's instead been reduced to in our country.
We have time for one more question. Can you please keep it brief?
Good morning, sir. My question to you is, today you stated that in a state, no religion should be ostensibly given more importance. But what about in the case of a state like India, where so much of our culture and our heritage is derived from religion? What would you suggest that the state should do in terms of a condition like this?
So I have no difficulty with the religious influences upon culture, because it's what in some ways makes us distinctively Indian. The example I gave here earlier of smashing a coconut on a ship when every Western country smashes a bottle of champagne is actually a manifestation of Hinduism as culture rather than as religion. Or in a very different example I also give in the book, when Robert and Maggie Amritraj named their 3 tennis-playing sons with Hindu names, Vijay, Anand and Ashok, that was culture, not religion. They're very, very openly Christian. They used to kiss the cross around their necks whenever they scored a good point or when they were at a tense moment in a match. Nothing to do with religion. But they said as part of our culture, we want them to have quote-unquote Indian names, by which was meant in this case Hindu names. And so it goes. I would see no great difficulty. For example, it is pointed out by the Hindutva types that Indonesia, which is an overwhelmingly Muslim population country, carries a picture of Ganesha on their banknotes, because for them Ganesha is their old Hindu culture. 1,000 years it's been supplanted by Islam, but they call their airline Garuda. They have Ganesha on their banknotes, and their best-selling brand of clove cigars is called Ramayana. So the culture lingered even when the religion changed. So my argument is, of course, in our case, the religion is not going to change. 80% of Indians are Hindus, but culture is not a problem. The problem is only when there is a religion or a religious community that is being particularly privileged or favored. Is it, for example, wrong that the Rashtrapati throws an iftar dinner during Ramadan, during Eid, during Ramadan, during the fasting months when they break the fast to the end? In our country, right until the BJP came to power, both the president and the prime minister would throw an iftar dinner. Now, under the BJP, they've stopped doing so. I would challenge them and say, this is actually culture. This is no different from smashing a coconut. Or you check into a 5-star hotel and some pretty girl comes and puts a tilak on your forehead. She isn't marrying you. She's just welcoming you to the hotel. That's also culture. It's not religion. So my point is, there's a great value in these kinds of symbolic depictions of culture. It makes us, in a sense, feel more rooted in our Indianness. But it can be Hindu, it can be Muslim, it can even be certain kinds of Christian habits. The role of the traditional Kerala lamp in every Kerala church is quite striking. You don't find anything like it in Western Christianity. That is very much an Indian cultural adaptation by Christianity in India. So you can find all of these examples throughout our country, and my own view is that is the celebration of pluralism I'm all about. I don't think we need to be godless in order to be secular in the Indian sense, or pluralist in my sense of the term. We can all respect our own faiths while accepting it's the private business of each individual how they choose to worship. And at the same time, it's also the private business of those who choose not to worship anyone at all. The state will not consider that either an advantage or a disability. You lead your own life. Let the state then have an opportunity to treat all citizens equally. My big worry right now with what's going on is the danger that the approach of those in power today, the very people who would divide us into Ramzadeh and Haramzadeh, the very people who speak about, who say that, if you don't agree with Mr. Modi, you should go to Pakistan. I mean, why Pakistan? If you want to send your enemies far away, suggest Canada, for God's sake, But you're suggesting Pakistan to send a message. I fear that all of these things will in fact reduce India into a Hindu Pakistan. And I want to stand up through this book and through my other writings and speeches against the idea of Hindi, Hindu, Hindutva as an all-embracing, narrowly defining and limiting slogan that I think impoverishes both our public discourse and our social and cultural values.
Well, thank you very much, Shashi. And we must end it there. Shashi said it's not a political book, but But he'll be signing copies, so when he becomes Prime Minister, it'll be a very valuable issue.